I didn't know my grandparents on my mother's side very well. I remember my grandmother left me £50 in her will, but that was probably when I was about 2. And of course, £50 when I was 2 was a lot of money. It didn't grow very fast. It went into a savings bank account. And I think by the time I actually spent it, it had got up to about £70 or £80. And I was then able to buy a motorbike, which would today cost something like £2,000. I think I bought a BSA Bantam with it. So my grandfather on my mother's side, I didn't know at all, really. I can't actually remember meeting him, but I heard about him. On my father's side, I can remember my grandfather fairly vaguely. I would have been about, I suppose, 6 when he died. And I can just remember he always used to, instead of saying good morning, he always used to say paddywhack and try and catch me. But my grandmother, on his side, lived a lot longer than him. I mean, she died in 1962, where he died in 1937. And my grandmother was a fairly formidable lady. She didn't get on with all her family terribly well. She didn't speak to one of her sons for about the last 10 years of his life. And one of her daughters came to see her and apparently lasted about 20 minutes before she went off again. But I always found that she was easy and really a very nice person. I can remember little things about her. I remember once she wanted to give me a pair of boots, and I'd been used to buying fairly cheap boots, and she said, no, I want you to have the best boots. And she went up to a firm called Hoggs of Fife that I can remember. I think are still going today. Whether they were a good bootmaker or not, I don't know. But she certainly had the principle of getting the best, or said she had. Well, both my grandfathers, on my mother's side and on my father's side, were barristers. They actually went and ate their dinners, or whatever you did in those days. I don't think you eat dinners now, but you may still do. But in fact, they didn't have many cases. I think my grandfather on my mother's side had one case which he lost, and my grandfather on my father's side said he'd never lost a case, but he equally had never had one. Obviously, I knew my mother much better because my father was killed in the war, and he'd been in both world wars, first one and the second one. I didn't know him ever particularly well. I can remember him asking me to look after my mother, if anything happened to her, and that's one of the few things I can actually remember him saying to me. When the First World War started in 1914, my father would have been at Eton, aged probably about 15 or 16, and he decided that he ought to join up. So I suppose about the age of about 16 and a half, he ran away from school and he went and joined the Guards in Windsor. And apparently my grandfather found out and decided that this wasn't a good thing, so he went to collect him. My grandfather had a beard, and he marched out onto the parade ground where a sergeant was drilling my father and explained that my father couldn't join because he was underage. And so the sergeant major sort of called him out of the ranks and said, your nanny's come to collect you, because my grandfather had a beard. And so he was then taken back, and he was actually sent to Sandhurst fairly soon after, and he did a sort of short course. And then he joined the Rifle Brigade from Sandhurst and went and fought in France. At the end of the First World War, he volunteered to go to Russia, where the British were sending a sort of volunteer force, I think it was called an expeditionary force, to help the Tsars. So he probably wouldn't have been very popular in Russia after the war. But anyway, he came back from there, having been wounded and lost 2 fingers. That was when he went off farming with his brother and had a fairly short career as a farmer, although I think he made quite a lot of money in New Zealand because he apparently had a farm out there which was eventually sold to support my mother. When he had trained himself as a pilot, which I think he had to do off his own bat, he was applying for a job. And one of the jobs he applied for was at Wilson Airways, which was in Kenya. And that was when he met my mother. And when they first got married, they went out to live there. When he was applying for that job, the job said no old school ties need apply. So there was a good prejudice against public schools even before the Second World War. And my father wrote back and said, "You needn't worry about my old school tie because I never wear a tie anyway."
So those stories kind of tell something about the kind of man that he was. I know you don't remember him very well, but what was he like?
I think he was, apparently, one of my uncles told me that he actually quite liked danger. And I think he did like danger because I heard about when he was flying his bomber. When he was flying a bomber over Germany, apparently most of the crew were fairly frightened and they were looking at anti-aircraft shells sort of bursting below them and that sort of thing. My father used to say, "How lovely it is down there. Don't you wish we were down there?" That sort of thing. And the crew thought he was obviously just, I don't know. It's very difficult to think what he was like. He was obviously, I think he was a leader. I mean, he rose through the ranks in the Air Force fairly quickly when he joined up in the Second World War. And he was never wanted to be a station commander. And when he was made a station commander, he immediately applied to go back onto flying duties, that sort of thing. But because he'd obviously been trained at Sandhurst, had a commission in the army, had learned to fly, he was obviously quite a valuable chap and could, I think I could probably do what he wanted. I heard that he used to, when he was told where he was going to bomb, he always used to put up an alternative plan to the powers that be, saying, why don't we go to this place or that place instead? But that's what someone told me. I think he was his own man. You just don't know as much as you ought to know about things. I sort of know what I've been told, bits and pieces. I get told and then put them together and you build up a picture. Don't know whether you're right or wrong, but you just hope that you are right.
Well, you've got quite a lot of information about him, don't you? That he sounds like he was an extraordinarily brave and dynamic person, wasn't he? And
yes,
funny.
Yes, I think he was. I think he was a great character. Yeah, I think he was a great character. And I don't know what he would have done if he had recovered. If he'd come back from the war, I suspect that he would have probably ended up running his estate in Shropshire, which is what I did in the end. And it would have been rather mundane for him, I think. But I dare say by the time he was sort of 40 or 50, it would have been all right. I think my mother was a fantastic woman because when she lost her husband, she was left with two small boys, very little money, and trying to educate us. And my father had never, I don't think, thought that we were going to have to be educated, or he hadn't decided to make any plans for it. So my mother came back here when my father was killed, she suddenly found she didn't know where we were going to go to school or anything.
You said that you remember your father saying, take care of your mother if anything happened to him. And did you take that seriously?
Well, of course I did. But I mean, she was far too independent to ask me to do very much for her. I mean, she was an incredible woman. She was very independent. She didn't want to be a burden to her children. And when I inherited the Bitley estate, I tried to get her to live at Bitley Court. I wanted to turn Bitley Court into 2 houses for her, but she didn't want that. She didn't want to live with her daughter-in-law. And she eventually went and lived in a sort of house called the Coach House down in South Wales, which she ran as a sort of bed and breakfast place and made a bit of a living doing that. She didn't want to. I don't think she would have wanted to in any way be a burden on her children. It's quite interesting because I suspect that most parents feel like that, and most children probably don't particularly want their parents to be a burden on them. I don't know. My mother was a very tough woman. Yes, she was very tough. She was quite sentimental in some ways, but I think she was... I don't think she ever looked at another man after her husband was killed. And I don't know how easy it was. I mean, some of those war widows did find themselves new men, but of course there was a great shortage of eligible men. And I don't think my mother would have been at all interested. I don't know. It's can't be sure, really.
She must have missed him terribly, your father.
Well, yeah, there's no question that my mother wouldn't have missed my father. I mean, she was absolutely... I mean, I think she was pretty devastated by it. But she was determined to go on with her life, really. And, of course, for the quite a long time, she really lived through my brother and me. I mean, she put me through Eton, she put my brother through Eton, she put me through university. And of course it wasn't until we started going out into the world that she started to lose touch. And I think probably I didn't spend as much time as I should have done with her after I'd sort of started my own life.
But she'd made you this independent man, hadn't she? So it sounds like she wouldn't have wanted you to feel...
No, I'm sure she wouldn't. I'm sure she would have. She was very independent, actually. I mean, she was very strong, but she was very independent. She did her own thing, and she travelled around the world. And she did cooking jobs. She did a cooking job in New Zealand when she decided that she wanted to see a bit more of the world. She was a pretty powerful lady.
And do you see, which of your parents do you think you were like? What characteristics do you think you inherited from your parents?
I haven't the remotest idea. I think I'm probably fairly dogmatic. I'm fairly... I think both my parents had a good sense of humour, and I hope I've got a good sense of humour. I hope that I'm reasonable about thinking what other people are thinking and that sort of thing, which I think they were good at. I mean, I don't think they were either of them. I don't think they were either of them autocratic, and I hope I'm not. I don't think I am. I remember having a governess in Egypt who was a German governess, and I don't remember much about her, but I remember wanting to be with my mother when we were staying at a hotel in London called the Tudor Court Hotel, which I think is still going on as a kind of funny little place in South Kensington or somewhere. But it had a lift, and I was running away because I didn't want to go with the governess. I wanted to stay with my mother, and I was going up the stairs, and she was going up the lift to sort of meet me up the stairs. And I remember that terrific chase. Anyway, after we'd done that, we went to Egypt, and I think we were probably in Egypt for about 2 years, probably about 2 years. And my father worked for a firm called Mizrair Work, and that became, I think, Egyptian Airways. When we were in Egypt, the Second World War broke out, so my father decided to come back to England to join the Air Force. And I and my mother and my brother were all sent on ahead. Can't remember much about it, but I do remember the name of the boat we came back to England on. It was called El Nile, which I suppose is the Nile. And when we got back to England, my father joined up, and then we had this sort of business where she was traipsing around, trying to be with him, trying to look after us, trying to... And most of the time, I think I spent it bitterly with my grandparents. And my mother would come when my father wasn't around. I remember I was a prefect, and I was de-prefected for stealing apples out of the school kitchen gardens. And I had various problems with my headmaster. I can't remember all of them. I remember one of the things that I did, which I thought was rather clever, but he didn't, was we had a thing called Kennedy's Shorter Latin Primer. I think we all used to change the name of that to Kennedy's Shorter Eating Primer by sort of altering the words. And at the back of that there was a vocabulary, and at the top of each section of the vocabulary there was a letter. And in my copy I thought of all the really rude words I could think of. For each letter, sort of, I put all the things I could think of for A and for B and for C, and I got pretty well the whole way down. I think I may have had slight difficulties with X and Z, but I don't remember too much. But anyway, my headmaster got given this thing, and I remember he said to me, "Where did you learn all these words?" And I was racking my brains. I couldn't think what word to say. So I said, "From my mother." that was rather embarrassing, because actually I hadn't, of course. And I think he said something to her, and she said, "Well, you certainly didn't learn them from me." But anyway, I got into trouble for that. And eventually... When I was at that school, for some reason I must have been slightly cleverer than some of the others, because I know I was put in for the scholarship exam at Eton, which I didn't get. But after my headmaster allowed me to stay at the school until he got the result of the scholarship exam. Once he'd got it, he said, "Well, you can go home now. I don't want you anymore." And I was sent off. My mother managed to get me into a little school near Bitterley in Ludlow, which was called Heatherdown. That was a school that is going today. It's at Ascot, actually. But it had been evacuated to Downton Hall, which is virtually 2 miles from Bitterley, where I live now, where I used to live, and 2 miles from where I live now. And when I was at that school, I used to ride over every day, because I had a horse then, and I could sort of tie it up or put it into a stable, and I was a sort of day boy. I was only there for, I think it was 2 months, but that was great fun. I managed somehow to get into Eton. I think one of the reasons I got into Eton was because my prep school master gave me apparently the worst reference that my housemaster at Eton had ever seen. And so he decided that he just had to take me because he wanted to see what this chap was like. And he also had known my father. I remember when I got there, he showed me some work that my father had done for him. So my mother put 2 sons through Eton with a bit of help from... We both got bursaries from Eton, which obviously paid about 1/3 of the fees, and an uncle paid another 1/3 of all our fees, then my mother had to pay a third of the fees at Eton, and even that for a war widow was quite a lot. But she bought a small farm, she worked jolly hard, and I think she lived for her children. It's difficult to sort of know what it would have been like to be a war widow in those days. There weren't very few men around. And when I got to Eton, I did reasonably well after a bit. I enjoyed it. There was everything you could want, really, as a young boy. You had all the games you wanted. You had good school lessons. I was reasonably okay with the lessons and that sort of thing. And so I had quite a successful career at Eton. One of the things I do remember learning at my public school was that life isn't fair. I mean, I had a lot of lessons throughout my career where it's telling me that life isn't fair. But I remember one of them was that we used to have a thing at Eton called the 4th of June, and the rowers used to go down the river, and then they used to stand up and put their oars above them in the boat. And it was quite a spectacular thing, and they had straw hats with flowers in it. They took those off and shook them. And it was always considered quite funny by those taking part to sort of make the boat capsize, and the authorities obviously didn't want the boat to capsize. And I can remember when I was in a boat, the captain of the boat came to me and said, "If your boat capsizes, I'm going to 8-tan you." And 8-tanning was rather an unpleasant form of corporal punishment because it was done by the captain of boats, who had a very strong arm and that sort of thing. And so I said, but that wouldn't be fair because it might not be me who had caused the boat to capsize. And he said, well, this, I can tell you, is something that you will learn if you haven't already learnt it. Life isn't fair. So I thought, well, in that case, I'm going to try and make sure this boat doesn't capsize. I thought the one thing I can't do is tell anyone else what he said, because they will think that I would get 8-tanned and they wouldn't. So I made sure that the boat didn't capsize. And afterwards I discovered that he'd said exactly the same thing to everyone else in the boat. And they'd all had exactly the same thoughts. Not to tell anyone else, but to make sure it didn't capsize. And needless to say, we didn't capsize. We were beaten for all sorts of things. You would be beaten for being late. And I can remember on one occasion, I thought it would be rather funny to stop the house clock, because that would make everyone late for chapel. So I went and stopped the house clock, and they found out that it was me, and I got beaten for that. I got beaten once for climbing down the fire escape. I remember climbing down the fire escape and getting halfway down and realizing that the fire escape didn't go right to the floor. So I had to then try and climb back up. And of course someone had shut the window so that I couldn't get in. So I was caught on the fire escape, and I got beaten for that. I can't remember many other things I was beaten for, but it was really... Of course, one of the things that everyone got beaten for at Eton was they used to have a thing where the senior boys were able to call boy, and the one who came and was last was given a job to do, like take a message to a boy in another house. And what was considered a very heinous crime was, instead of running when they called boy, was to just hide in your room and not run at all, so that you didn't have any risk of having to do the chore. But I can't remember everything that I got beaten for. But I stopped actually getting beaten after about my first year. I don't know why. I just decided that it was painful and not particularly profitable.
When you say beaten, you were cane. Was it a cane?
They used to cane you, yeah. You got various sorts of caning at Eton. There was a thing you got at the house, and then there was a thing called pop tanning, when you were caned with a different sort of cane, which was a sort of Malacca one with knobs on. I think there's any beating at Eton now at all. I never heard of any of my children being beaten. I think it probably stopped fairly soon after I left. I don't know exactly when it was stopped.
And in retrospect, what do you think about that kind of punishment?
It never bothered me particularly. I can see that some people probably would have thought it was they might have thought it was very undignified, which I suppose it was, being made to bend over and having your bottom hit. But it didn't bother me particularly. It was quite painful. And you had to try and make sure that you didn't yelp too much. But I didn't think it was particularly serious. I think probably in my book, there were much more serious punishments. I mean, some of the punishments you got, sort of like being put into detention, would last for sort of half a day or something. That was much worse than being beaten, I think. But I don't know. I suppose it's something to do with the pain threshold. Is it some people hate pain and some people can take it. And I obviously didn't like it when it happened, but it didn't last very long. I rowed for the 8 one year, and then I distinguished myself the second year by being thrown out of the 8 and down into the second 8, and because they said I unbalanced the crew or something, and so that was all right. So some people when that happened to them, they sort of took umbrage and decided to stop rowing at all, but I didn't mind particularly. And then what was slightly more undignified in my case was having been thrown out of the first 8. I was then in the second 8, and then I got thrown out of the second 8. So I ended up in the third 8. And again, I didn't take terrible umbrage to that either. The interesting thing was that of the 3 8s, the only one that actually won their regatta was the third 8. I boxed at Eton, and I was reasonably successful. I mean, I won the sort of heavyweight champion thing. And when I went to university, I also boxed, and that was partly because it was a sport that you could do when you felt like it. You weren't part of a team, so you didn't all have to get together. And it was it was always considered quite a good thing to get a blue at Cambridge. And boxing was probably the easiest thing of all to get a blue at, because no one else really wanted to do it. So I did it for 3 years. The slight problem I had was that I boxed against the same man at Oxford each year. And I was a light heavyweight the first year, and he was a light heavyweight. So I thought, well, next year, he said, I'm not going to box next year. So he became a heavyweight, and I became a heavyweight. We didn't train so much. But then they couldn't get anyone on the Oxford side. So I had to fight him again, and again he won. And then in the third year, I again had to box him. I had to box the same chap at Oxford 3 years running. And every year he beat me, which was rather annoying. But anyway, I suppose I could call myself a triple blue, although being a triple boxing blue isn't necessarily a particularly great sport. I sort of liked the idea of being an engineer. I had an uncle who was an engineer and had read engineering at Cambridge. I'm not sure, looking back on it, whether it was the best thing to have read. I don't know. One will never know, I think, because I'm quite interested in money. And of course, I didn't learn anything about money at Cambridge. I mean, I think in some ways I'd sooner been something like, I wouldn't have minded being a chartered accountant, although they have a pretty awful life. But I wouldn't have minded doing that. I wouldn't have minded being a banker, although everyone's rude about bankers. And I just don't know, really, whether engineering was the right thing to have read. But in those days, jobs were easy to get in almost anything you did. I think Cambridge was a very happy time. I think I undoubtedly should have worked harder. I mean, I think Cambridge was a place where you met a lot of people, and it was always jolly nice talking to people. And you used to go, people used to give parties, and you really had a lot of distractions from actually working, and I think I should have worked much harder at Cambridge. In those, I mean, nowadays, if you go to Cambridge and come away without a particularly good degree, you can't get a job. In those days, if you went to Cambridge, as long as you came away with some sort of degree, you were all right. One of the beauties of Cambridge was that I was able to join a thing called the University Air Squadron, and on that I just used to go off and fly whenever I wanted almost. And initially I was flying with an instructor, but once you got a certain number of hours, you could just go and fly on your own. And I loved that. I really loved flying. I was in the Air Squadron all 3 of my years. And then when I left Cambridge, I joined the Air Force for national service. And because I had a degree, and I'd been in the University Air Squadron, I went straight into the Air Force as an acting pilot officer, which meant that I didn't have to do all that terrible square bashing and making your own bed and cleaning your own shoes that everyone else had to do. And it's probably one of the things that has damaged my career. I've always had it too easy, but it was very nice, and I enjoyed my time in the Air Force enormously, because I think flying is just something that people like doing. Some people most people I think probably would like to do it, and I loved doing it. The sort of feeling of being alone in an aeroplane and sort of whizzing around was just great. And so another advantage, of course, being in the Air Squadrons was that I got quite a big bounty. I mean, in those days, I think the bounty was £35 a year. But when you're living, I think I lived at Cambridge, I lived on about 400 a year. So £35 bounty was a big bonus, and enabled you to do something else. And after I finished my national service, I joined the Auxiliary Air Force, which was a sort of kind of territorial thing, and we just used to go, and that was heaven, because we just used to go down to a place called North Weald outside London every weekend and just fly airplanes. And we could fly a thing called a Meteor, which was a very nice airplane to fly, an easy airplane to fly, relatively speaking. I wasn't a particularly good pilot, but I mean, I just loved it. It was because I was a bad pilot, I was very often given the job of towing the target. And this meant that you had a great big thing like a sort of glorified windsock behind you, which you towed along, and all the other pilots would be firing at it. And it was quite boring for the chap who was towing the target. So when I came back from it, I thought, well, I'll drop the target off on the airfield, which I did, and I thought I'll show off a bit. So I turned upside down, and I decided to fly upside down across the airfield. And as I turned, my stick stuck, and it wouldn't go on round. I was going to do a rail, and it wouldn't go on round. So then fortunately, I turned it back, and it went back. So I was up the right way again. So then in a panic, I shouted on air traffic control, I want a straight-in approach and landing. I'm not going to do it because something's wrong with my aircraft. And when I landed, a wing commander came out, and he waggled away at the stick. And he said, there's nothing wrong with your stick, it's perfectly all right. Well, on that occasion, I actually did know that there had been something wrong with it. So when I got back to the hangar, I said to the sort of chaps there, I said, look, you've just got to find out there's something wrong. And they found a torch in there, which someone had left in. And obviously the wing commander had got dislodged, it had stuck, caused the controls to stick. And then it'd been dislodged, and they were all right again. So I thought, well, this is a pretty poor show. So I said, well, what are you going to do about the fitter who left it in there? He ought to be, put on a charge or something. And they said, oh, we're not going to do anything about him, because what the problem we have is we can find it very difficult to get good fitters, but quite easy to get pilots who just have a lovely time swanning around doing nothing. So nothing happened, but that sort of taught me a lesson. I wasn't as valuable as I thought I was, I suppose. You had to do a graduate apprenticeship if you wanted to become what was called a chartered mechanical engineer. And so I decided that that was my career path. I think probably I was more interested in the business side than the engineering side of industry. And I'm not absolutely certain that I didn't waste my first few years, but anyway, I enjoyed it. And I changed my job from. I started with Northern Aluminium, and then I went to British Nylon Spinners. I got a better job in British Nylon Spinners, but then I didn't like that either. So I got what I thought was a better job, and I think it probably was a better job, certainly a better paid job, as what they called a management consultant. But it wasn't. You weren't doing anything very great as a management consultant. And when I was doing that job, I inherited the Bitterley estate, which was in a pretty poor shape. And I was working in Huddersfield. And I said to my employers that I wanted to be transferred down to the Midlands. He was a cracking chap, but unfortunately he got killed by a bull fairly soon after I joined as his assistant. And that was actually tragic, because I think he would have done really well. But anyway, the result of that was, from my point of view, was quite good, because I then sort of managed to work my way into his job instead of the people who owned the business, his heirs and executors, sold it to a company called Wolseley Hughes, who were a big holding company. And they obviously were looking for someone, having bought the business, they were looking for someone to run it. And as I was in the position anyway, I managed to stay there. And eventually I became the chief executive of what they called their agricultural machinery division. And so that I got onto the main board of Wolseley Hughes, who had bought McConnell when I worked for it. And I think what happened with Wolseley Hughes was that they had also got a business that made plumbing, or didn't make, it sold plumbing supplies, and it became a very big builders merchants, really. Fortunately, we were able to do a buyout, and that was how I sort of became managing director of our own business, really. We didn't own the whole lot, but we owned a fairly sizable part of it. And then we went public for a bit, and then we had a lot of difficulty with various things. I had some bad health, and I had some bad people working. So eventually we sold it. It seemed to be the best thing to do. And then I sort of retired. I suppose the first thing to say about my marriages is that I have been very lucky in having had two wonderful wives. The first wife was Geraldine Jones, and I met her in Newport when I was a graduate apprentice, and it would have been in about 1956, I think. And we got married in 1957, so it wasn't a very long engagement or anything. But there's no doubt that we had very happy years at the beginning of our marriage. We had 4 children, and unfortunately, when the fourth was born, she died, and that was tragic. I was then very lucky. 8 years later, I got married to Susan, who's my current wife, and she already had 3 children, so we've got 7 children, and altogether, and they run as one family, and I think we get on incredibly well. I think the whole family actually gets on. My first wife, Geraldine, she loved people. She thought one of the most important things in the world was to be happy, to make sure that everyone around you was happy. And I think she made a big effort to make sure that her children, when she knew them, while she was still alive, were having a really good life. Now, I was at that time working quite hard, so I probably didn't contribute as much to family life as I should have done. But I think we did have a happy time. You know, it was just a tragedy when she died. Geraldine was definitely a great believer in living life to the full and enjoying things. She came into Bitterley and it was an absolute menace when she came in. We'd been living in Doncaster before that in a small bungalow, and to move into a 14-bedroomed ruin was quite an experience for her, but she coped with that perfectly. She was wonderful. She was wonderful at sort of making do and managing and running the thing, and it was great. One of our children was born in South Wales, Susie. Next one was born in Doncaster. The third one was born in Ludlow, and the fourth one was born in Wolverhampton. And the sad thing is that we decided to sort of have a slightly more luxurious time, and we had our own nurse and everything. We went up to Wolverhampton when she was about to be born, and unfortunately it just went wrong. I think she had a hemorrhage, basically, which they couldn't put right.
And how did you cope in those first few years after that?
Well, I was very lucky in a way in that my mother-in-law came down, Jerry's sister came and looked after me for a bit in the very first period, and then they managed to get someone called Joan Fallot to come and work for me as a housekeeper. And Joan Fallot had known my family for years, and so she really ran the house for me. She was a wonderful person, and she's still alive today. I mean, she's aged 90, and we see her fairly regularly. And that was how I managed to get by. One was lucky, and one had a lot of friends who came and helped. It just was a terrible thing. I mean, I left Jerry at Wolverhampton Hospital, having just had her baby. No, not having had her baby, but about to have her baby, and thought that everything was all right and went home. And I was then rung up to say that she'd died, and it was a most ghastly journey back to the hospital. And fortunately, the obstetrician, or whatever he came back to Bitterley with me. He drove back to Bitterley with me, and they sort of helped me get just over the immediate thing. But it was just a terrible experience. And I think it was a terrible experience for all my children as well, because they suddenly found that they were without a mother. And they were actually without a mother for 8 years, although various people sort of helped out. Fortunately, in 1978, I was able to marry Susan. Goodness knows why she married me. She says it was persistence, but anyway, I married her, and she's looked after the family ever since. And her 3 children, my 4 children, I think get on well together. And I think it's been a fairly happy family. It came into my family in 1898, so when I moved out, we've been there over 100 years, and it has been a house, I think probably been a house for a very long time, but the main structure of the house was probably Henry VII's time, that sort of time. And then it was remodelled in about 1760. So it's not a period piece, but it's a fairly Georgian layout. And I've always thought it was a comfortable house. I think most people seem to think it's a comfortable house, although it's fairly rambling and large. But I think I hope it's been a happy house. It was certainly a happy house for me for a period, and then it was a happy house for Sue for a period, and then I think my son's happy there. So I think people have been happy there. It's not an architectural masterpiece, but it is shaped like an H, and it's been done up by a chap called Pritchard, who's sort of Georgianised it. Fun enough, the family that lived in it before the Wheelers were called Walcott, and they lived there for about 300 years. So it's only been in two families in the last 400 years, so it must have something quite good about it. I don't know what it is. It's a sort of, I think it is a kind of atmosphere you have. You feel relaxed. I feel relaxed when I get there, but I suppose I feel relaxed because when it was my house I felt relaxed. I felt relaxed even when it was my grandmother's house. I think that you do want, actually, and I don't know that I've necessarily done this, but I think you want to be true to your own convictions. I mean, I think the classic thing that brought it home to me was the fact that Maggie Thatcher was, I think, true to herself. And if she changed at all, it was changing in order to achieve what she wanted to achieve. In other words, she didn't change her opinions, but she just changed her way of getting what she wanted. And I think she did that. And I think that that's what people want to do. They want to be true to themselves. Now, if they want to have a life where they don't have to work very hard, where they don't have a very high standard of living, that's fine. They must do it, and they must enjoy it and feel that they're doing the right thing. I mean, I know hundreds of people who are very happy living on virtually nothing. And I know hundreds of people who are very happy living on a lot. And so it's terribly important to try and end up as a happy person. Try and be happy is probably the best bit of advice you can give to anyone. And whatever disadvantages come your way, you've got to try and overcome them and stay true to yourself and stay happy. I don't think that the fact that my father was killed actually changed me enormously. I think I would probably have ended up as the same person, I think. And I hope that I haven't influenced my own children unduly. I hope that they've always felt that they can come and talk things over with me, and I hope that they've always felt that at the end of the day, if they have talked things over, they've gone away, perhaps more certain in their own minds of what they want to do. I think if you know what you want to do, you don't need to go and talk to anyone about it. If you don't know what you want to do, talking to someone about it may help you to crystallize your own thoughts. And that is about all I think you can do. I don't think I can claim or say or convince anyone that I would have been different if I'd had a father after I was sort of, whatever it was, 10. And I don't think I wouldn't like to think that I've influenced my children other than to persuade them that to take the right course, whatever the right course is for them, and to try and decide for themselves what they want to do, rather than come to me and say, should I be a carpenter or should I be a painter? I don't think I'd like to do that. I don't think I'd like to influence my children to do something that they didn't themselves feel was what they wanted to do. What do I regret? I think in my business career, I regret not being slightly tougher with the people who were working with me. I think I should have. I think, quite honestly, I think some of them I should have fired fairly early on in their careers, and instead of that, I didn't. I think it is quite important when you're running a business to be a bit more positive than I was about certain things. Now, what else have I done that I regret? I don't regret anything, I don't think, that I've done as far as my family is concerned. I don't think I regret anything that I've done as far as my houses and life has been concerned. I think I possibly should have had a different career path. I think I should probably have tried to go into business, but not go into it as an engineer, go into it as perhaps more on the management side, I don't know. Well, I'm certainly proud of my family. I mean, I'm proud of all of them. I mean, some of them have done better than others, but none of them, as far as I know, none of them actually criminals, they're none of them drug takers, they're none of them addicts, they're none of them... And fortunately, they've all got fairly good, healthy lives. So I'm certainly proud of my family. I'm proud of what we've done in the way of this house. I'm proud of. I think that largely my wife's doing, but I'm proud of my wife. I'm proud of... trying to think... Was that the question? What are you proud of? Yeah. I think house, family, job to a certain extent, but I think I could have made a better job of it if I'd been more dictatorial. Although I don't like people being dictatorial, I think if I had fired people when they went against me instead of reasoning with them, I think I'd have been better.
You're proud of the way you conduct your own life. You conduct yourself as a...
I can't think of anything. No, I can't think of anything. I think I am quite proud of the way I conduct my own life. I mean, on the whole, I pay my bills. I try and keep people happy. I try and look after people who I'm responsible for. I think I am quite proud of the way I conduct my own life. I think it's... Yes, no, I think I am proud of the way I conduct my own life. I can't think of anything that I'm not proud of, that I've really done sort of wicked. I can't think of anything. Probably are hundreds of things.